So this afternoon, I want to talk about this grand experiment that companies in the US are doing called Dojos to help upskill their teams and their people in their organizations. Along the way, I also want to share some things about fostering learning. So even if you leave this talk deciding you don't want to start a dojo, if you're in any way involved in helping other people learn, you should have some actionable items that you could take with you right away. And as a bonus, I'm going to share a little bit of a story about how a rock star probably had a pretty big influence on the name of this conference. So let's start by kind of talking about the problem or the opportunity. We've seen several presentations over the course of the last day and a half that talk about the value stream. This is kind of how I look at the value stream. Someone has an idea on the left end of the value stream, and it ends when we have that product idea in the customer's hands and it's providing value to the customer. We're told these days that we need to improve things along the entire value stream. So when I started, it was about delivery, and I learned XP and Scrum, and it was kind of in this product delivery box. We had technical practices like test-driven development, continuous integration, et cetera. DevOps has come along and said, no, there's this stuff that happens after product delivery, and it's not just enough to create your WAR file or whatever and check it into Artifactory. There's also a whole world of DevOps stuff, and now there's all these new DevOps practices. You go towards the left, and there are people like Marty Kagan and Jeff Patton out there who are teaching teams how to do product discovery and bring design thinking and product thinking into product development. So if you look at the entire product development value stream, there's a ton of practices out there that we need to deliver. If any of you saw Jez's talk yesterday, he was talking about the research that they've done and the correlation between well-performing teams and what practices that they have implemented and gotten good at. Okay, that's great, Jez. We know what practices are going to lead to high-performing organizations. How do we learn those practices? And that's what I'm here to talk about. So there's this big debate. You can Google this. You'll see a bunch of articles come up. Do we train or hire? What's the best approach here? For me, from my experience, we've gotten to a point now where we can't hire. There just aren't enough good people out there anymore. Even if there are enough good people, after a year or two, there's a whole new set of skills, whole new things that people have to learn once they get into an organization. So we need to figure out a way to invest in the people inside of our organizations. This is echoed by people like Jez, by people like Tim O'Reilly. They talk about this need for investing in the people in our companies. Now, when we go about doing this, what's the typical way we help people upskill in organizations? You all know this. What do we do? We send people to courses and workshops, right? Often these two-day courses and workshops. There's often a lot of certifications around these. We know these work because there's an abundance of them. You can Google everything in that value stream, and there will be two-day courses where you can get certifications, right? We know this works. This is the way our industry works. Well, okay, wait a second. I have to walk that back a bit. As Mike Rother, who some of you might be familiar with from the Toyota Kata space, says, neuroscience is actually teaching us that if we have these one-off or very rare training events, the neuroscience says we're not actually teaching people how to work differently. We're teaching them business as usual. It's okay. Mike wrote this in 2015, neuroscience. It's been around a while, but it's relatively new in the mainstream, so maybe we should forgive ourselves. Wait, I'm going to have to walk that statement back as well. So this is Hermann Ebbinghaus. He's a German psychologist. In 1885, he did experiments about memory and learning. And he created this thing called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. This is a generally accepted theory of learning and, more importantly, retention. Sadly, for classroom-style learning, we can forget up to 90% of what we've learned in, say, a two-day training event within a month. Now, the keys to remembering are things like repetition. So another thing that Ebbinghaus came up with is something called the spacing effect. So if we repeat the learning over time, we have spaced repetition, then we are more likely to remember. And the second aspect of this is the quality of the memory itself. So if we can somehow get a better quality of what's happening in our brains as we're learning new materials and sort of forming literally the new connections in our brain, we have a better chance of remembering things. So I did an experiment a few weeks ago, and I just went out and I searched on coach on LinkedIn, and I started looking at all of the different certifications that people who identify as coaches have after their names. I'm sure this is not exhaustive, but this is a list of them that came up. And I know many of us have them. Many of us are in jobs that require that we have certain certifications. I don't really have all these. I don't know if I would trust anyone who had a LinkedIn profile who had all these certifications after their name. But these are harmless, right? And going and learning these things and getting these certifications, it's harmless. Well, wait, maybe I need to walk that one back a little bit too. I've seen many cases where people go through these two-day courses, these two-day certification things, and they get into an organization and they're actually causing harm. So one organization I worked in, they brought in Jeff Patton to help them with product discovery. For those of you who aren't familiar with Jeff Patton, he wrote the book User Story Mapping. Story mapping is a great technique for kind of exploring a problem domain, writing stories to be delivered in some kind of agile or lean process, but laying them out in a way where you can see alternatives between different stories. You can see the flow, and it's all based on what the person using the product is doing. So Jeff comes in, he works with a bunch of people, they do this really good product discovery, they do customer interviews, they do lo-fi paper prototypes, they gather all this feedback, they tweak the product idea over time. They get to a point where they say, yes, we are going to now execute on delivering this product, it's a good idea. When they got to product delivery, someone with one of these certifications said, we need to throw away all those stories because they're not in the as a blank, I can blank, so that blank format. And that's the standard format that we use here for writing stories. We don't do anything else, so we have to throw these away, start over, or at least translate them. So these certifications, I think, can be bad because they're not holistic. They are based on individual parts of the product development value stream. They're not done in such a way that ties everything together. So maybe it's not the certifications, maybe it's Scrum, maybe it's XP, it's Agile, it's Lean. Maybe we just need a new process and a new metaphor for how we deliver. Well, I'm not sure that's the case either. It's popular these days to think of release trains. When I think of release trains, this is what comes to mind for me. Release trains to me are still about really big, huge batches of requirements, things lumped into projects with the hope that we throw everything on the train, and some point in the future, the train is going to pull into the station. I think if we were talking about release metros, maybe, where there's a lot of trains constantly going and traveling, and there's different pathways, and we're releasing very frequently, that's a different metaphor that might apply, but this whole idea of release trains is something that I'm not sure works real well. I think Andy Hunt actually summed up this problem very well over 10 years ago. He makes the point that getting good at something is not simply about mastering a body of knowledge. It's not about having a syllabus or a predefined curriculum and just saying, check, 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 I've learned all of these things. It's really more about building the mental model in your mind, understanding the domain deeply, understanding your practices, and actually practicing the practices over time that's ultimately going to lead to expertise and improve your performance. Another critical piece of this is you need to get feedback on your progress along the way in order to make progress. So there's a need for something different. So please forgive me this slight diversion. I will tie this back. I promise it will make sense. This is Robert Fripp. Robert Fripp is an English guitar player. You may not have heard of him, but you've probably heard his music. These are a few of the albums that he's played on. He's actually been responsible for sort of launching two genres of music. When King Crimson released In the Court of the Crimson King in 1969, that sort of launched prog rock. Jimi Hendrix saw King Crimson perform once that year and said, this is the best band in the world. He did 2 albums with Brian Eno that launched ambient music as a thing, and then he's worked with a lot of other people. I think David Bowie's best work, particularly Heroes, is the work that he did with Fripp. So 30 years ago now, I spent a year living in this house. It's called Red Lion House. It's in a very small town in southern England called Cranbourne. There's about 200 residents. The picture on the left there is actually us doing a recording. You can tell it's 30 years ago because those are a bunch of reel-to-reel tapes on the shelf behind us. We record digitally now. That's actually me standing up in the back of that picture with the ugly gray sweater with the black X on it, and I actually had some hair at that point. The thing about this was my first sort of exposure to an immersive learning environment. I say I spent the better part of a year here. We lived here for a year. We ate together, we got up in the morning, we meditated together for a half hour. We would practice individually, and every day, we had Saturdays off, but every day other than Saturday, there was usually around a 2-hour period at night where we would play together as a group and practice repertoire and pieces. There was an offshoot performing group of this called the League of Crafty Guitarists. This was called Guitar Craft. One of the things that I think is really pertinent about this is this statement in the bottom paragraph here. The exact details of any one of these courses was not pre-described. It was not a syllabus, it was not a curriculum. The courses responded to the students who were on the course, where they were at in their own learning, their own ability to play music, and the course was tailored around that. So very experiential learning, immersive. We learned from each other, we learned from an instructor. In the classes, the courses were tailored to where we were at the time. So I ran out of money and had to start paying back my student loans, so I moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, started going to grad school, and I ran across this guy named Dave West. These are a couple of his books. Now, Fripp used to say, music is a quality without a name, organized in sound. It's a little sort of out there, kind of trippy. I'm in an OO class with Dave West. This was pre-Java. I was learning Smalltalk from him. I think it was the only graduate school in the United States at the time that had Smalltalk as part of its curriculum. So he was sort of a fringy guy. And one day he comes into class and he starts talking about Christopher Alexander and how we might be able to build the software that has the quality without a name. So if some of you are familiar with Christopher Alexander, he's an architect, and the software patterns movement is based on his work. He used to talk about buildings that exhibit the quality without a name. What is this sort of quality we all know exists, hard to measure, hard to describe, so it's the quality without a name. That made my ears perk up after working with Fripp for a while, and I started having conversations with Dave about software maybe as a craft. So when I was with Fripp, we were talking about guitar playing as a craft, guitar craft, how do you approach this instrument as a craft? Maybe we approach software like this. So Dave had his own ideas very much along these lines, and in 1998 there was a workshop group at an Upskill conference in the United States called Software as a Studio Discipline. And this book, this group of people eventually led to Pete McBreen, I think that's a typo on the slide, coming out with his book, Software Craftsmanship. So there's a pathway through here all the way back to Fripp. I had a very small piece in it, sort of communicating ideas. Dave West was part of this working group. So I think a rock star sort of had an impact on the name of this conference. Back to Dave. Dave left the university that I was at in Minnesota and went to a small university in New Mexico in the US, and he started this apprenticeship-based software development program. Now, this program was a one-room schoolhouse kind of thing. Graduate students worked with undergraduate students. There were no classes. There were competencies that were defined. So in order to get certain degrees, you had to demonstrate that you had competencies, and those would be programming-related, math-related because it was a university program, et cetera. But you could come into the program, and if you already knew calculus, say, you didn't need to take a calculus test. You just needed to demonstrate that you had a competency in doing calculus. The same for any of the technical programming skills. They did real world work. So Dave was able to get 2 local projects from one was a government, one was a local business, sort of a charity project. So the students were doing real world work, real world software development in the context of their learning. This had a big impact on me and my thoughts about how we should go about helping teams upskill. So this kind of leads to the dojo. Now, some of you may have just come from Emily's talk. This word dojo is something that's been around for a while. We use it in the context of software. Coding dojos, there was a coding dojo here late last night where they were doing a refactoring kata. Excellent book. Coding dojos, katas, are an excellent way to learn test-driven development and other technical practices. This is not quite what I'm talking about, although this deliberate practice as a way of learning is one of the key aspects of the kinds of dojos that I want to talk about today. So here's our definition of a dojo. It's a physical space where teams undergo an immersive learning experience. They set their own learning goals, both for the product that they're developing, the technical practices and the process practices and the product practices that they want to learn. They learn these practices with the support of skilled coaches, so it often takes more than one coach working with a team to address the entire set of practices across the entire value stream. And they do this in the context of doing real-world work. So unlike going to, say, a 2-day test-driven development course where you're learning TDD, but you're learning it in a very pristine sandbox environment with very canned examples, you're doing your learning in the context of your real-world work. So I've taught 2-day TDD courses. Usually I try to follow those up with coaching and on-site help, because what I hear over and over again is, yeah, it was great, I understood everything in the 2-day course, I got back to my desk, the next morning, I started trying to apply it to the legacy code base that I work in, couldn't figure out how to get anywhere. The rest of my team had also not gone through the course with me, so they didn't have the exact amount of buy-in necessary for me to kind of spread this and make it happen, so TDD died on our team. With the dojos, whole teams come in at a time and learn practices together. So we are working with individuals, obviously helping them learn new practices and skills, but we're also upskilling the entire team together, and they're learning how to work together as a team as a side effect. This is kind of a sample flow. We start with an overview. So a lot of times when you create these dojos in your organization, people are gonna say, huh, what's a dojo? What are you talking about? So if you think about this as sort of a sales or a marketing pipeline, we start with overviews. We then have consults, where if someone shows interest after an overview, maybe they bring their whole team in, and we go through this consultation with them. What are you interested in learning? What products are you developing? One of the key things we talk through during the consult sort of stage is, what product development are you doing and what sort of timelines are you under? Because the dojo is primarily about learning. In fact, a phrase I often use to describe it is it's about learning over delivery. So normally, we're asked to upskill in the context of doing our delivery, but don't let that delivery date slip. You have to learn all this stuff, but the delivery date is the primary and most important thing. And we all know how well the learning works in those contexts. The core of the dojo is in this big box here. So teams come in for 6 weeks. We do what we call a basic Scrum process, which helps us get into organizations that want some kind of Agile process. I would say it's the absolute minimal essentials of Scrum. It really is more like this plan, do, learn, act loop kind of thing. We do 2.5-day sprints. There are several reasons why we do 2.5-day sprints, tied back to some of the things I've already talked about. So by doing 2.5-day sprints, it gives us an opportunity for repetition and for doing that spaced repetition. We can repeat practices over and over and over again over the course of these 2.5-day sprints. What we're finding is a lot of teams struggle with getting things done. If they're doing Scrum, they're doing SAFe, they're doing some kind of time-boxed development style, they still struggle with getting things done. By having the teams do 2.5-day sprints, it kind of forces them to break the work down into really small stories. So they learn how to get things done, and in the way to do that, they finally, I'll say finally, learn how to break down stories into small increments. This is really powerful. We don't do any sizing in terms of points. Our sizing is primarily based around one question. Can we get it done in 2.5 days? If the answer is no, it's too big, and we need to break it down. So instead of thinking how big, we're moving from how big to is it too big? And if it's too big, we have techniques for breaking it down that teams learn. By doing 2.5-day sprints, learning has this margin of safety built into it. So you go off, you do something, whether it's a new design, you're practicing a new form of testing, you're trying some new cloud deployment capability, and you completely blow it. And we stop at the end of the sprint and we kind of assess what's going on. Well, only 2.5 days has gone by. You haven't blown 2 weeks, you haven't blown a month, you haven't headed down this rabbit hole where someone is going to say the cost of that failure is really high. So it gives us this margin of safety. Because it's 2.5 days, we're doing retrospectives really frequently. I think that leads to a mindset shift for a lot of teams where they're constantly reflecting how are we doing, how can we improve, rather that being a once a month or once every 2 week kind of things. And this also gives us an opportunity to stop very frequently and say, what's the next best investment in learning that we can make? So it's not only about delivery. Again, I mentioned it's about learning over delivery. So as we're learning, we're constantly reflecting and adjusting our initial plans for learning as well. Now, does every dojo experience have to be a 6-week experience? No. These are kind of the ways we look at this concept in terms of sort of what's negotiable, what's non-negotiable. What's non-negotiable primarily is this is about learning over delivery. This is not an accelerator. So some companies are building these labs, studios, internal areas that teams go in and they work with coaches. But the whole idea is as you go in, you're going to deliver faster while you're in there than you would have had you not gone in. We often communicate with leaders that, look, the dojo is an investment in upskilling your people. You can actually expect them to slow down a little bit. We need space for that learning to occur. Without space for that learning to occur, learning's not going to happen. So this is an investment long term. Very, very non-scientific answer I'll give to people when they ask how much do we have to slow down is I'll say, as a general rule of thumb, assume you're going to lose 50% of your productivity. So bring 3 weeks of work into a 6-week dojo experience. We're still going to do real-world work. All the learning happens in the context of that real-world work. But we're going to slow down so teams can upskill on these practices while they're doing that work. Now, the reality of this in some situations is we have seen teams that actually deliver faster over the course of the 6 weeks than they might have had they not come into the dojo. That could be for reasons of automating some of their deployments. We get some of their testing automated. In other cases, it's simply we get the team on the same page about what their product ideas are in the first place. And that's kind of like setting up dominoes on the floor. You push the first one and they all follow. I wouldn't ever advertise that for someone coming into the dojo, but we have had that experience. This is what it could look like for a couple different teams. So let's say your first team is primarily doing new product development, and the second team is doing cloud migration. I don't expect you to get into the details of that slide. You can look at it later. I'll make the slides available. The point I want to make here, though, is the dojo is customized for every team that comes in. So again, I'm harping on this, but there is no standard curriculum. One of the things that makes it as effective as it has been is we meet the teams where they are. So during that consult and chartering, which I'll elaborate on a little bit more in a second here, we figure out where the team is, what their learning goals are, what they're interested in learning in, and we customize the dojo experience around them. We customize the coaching around that. Obviously, you have to have good coaches with a broad range of skills across your set of coaches in order to be able to do this. So if this has any appeal to you, what I would say is start with your value stream and think about the outcomes that you're trying to achieve as an organization. What are you trying to improve? If it's the total life cycle, the time it takes you to get from your business idea to the product having value in customers' hands, then you're looking at where the constraints are in this system. If you are an organization where maybe you've adopted some DevOps practices and some Agile technical practices, and you feel like you've gotten pretty good at software development, but you're developing a lot of new capabilities that aren't getting much of an uptick in terms of customer use, your usage statistics, your analytics, your monitoring is saying people aren't really using a lot of what we're building. Again, referring back to Jez yesterday, he talked about some studies that show 1/3, in one company, 1/3 of the new features they were developing were actually being used. If that's the case, the outcome you probably want is better adoption. So maybe you focus on the left side of the value stream and your Dojo teams focus on product discovery as a skill that they want to learn. You can focus on a segment of the value stream. So if any of you have read the DevOps handbook, they talk about the DevOps value stream being from code commit to running in production. So that is a subset of this. It's a shorter subset towards the end here. You could start your Dojo focusing on a subset of the value stream. My advice to you would be to move towards a holistic, entire value stream approach as soon as you possibly can. The very first Dojo that started in the States was started at a large retailer, and they started it as a, quote, DevOps dojo. And this even led to the word dojo. Someone had been to a talk where the presenter was talking about developing DevOps Kung Fu. So it was this idea of mastery of the DevOps skills. They came back, they started working with teams, helping teams adopt DevOps skills. They said, hey, if this is about DevOps Kung Fu, where do you go to learn Kung Fu? Well, you go to a martial arts studio. Let's build this thing called a dojo. Practices can also be tied to values. So if you're struggling to identify where the constraints are or what the parts of your value stream are, where you want to develop and upskill practices, you can go back to your core values. What do we value? Quality, feedback, communication, et cetera. And talk about the practices that are going to help improve on the things that you value. An important point here is tools should come last. Tools should never be the starting point of your discussion about what you're going to teach in the dojo. It's not about learning AWS or Jenkins or Cucumber or any specific tools. It's more about the practices themselves and how those practices tie back to improvements in your value stream or to your core set of values. So I said a couple minutes ago, I'll dig into chartering a little bit more. Chartering is critical for dojos. So we generally try to do chartering a week or two before a team starts their 6-week dojo challenge. It helps us get alignment across the entire team about what's going to happen during the 6 weeks while they're in the dojo. It's an opportunity for us to define the outcomes that they want to achieve while they're in the dojo. So again, if you're picking up on a theme here, outcome-based. Usually takes about a half a day. This is what an agenda looks like for chartering. So we start with a team name. We talk time frame. Now you might be saying, why do you talk time frame if this is a 6-week fixed thing? One of the things we want to get really clear on is how much of the product development effort they're doing could be done during the 6 weeks in the dojo. It's very likely that teams will start product development in the dojo and finish it outside. Or maybe they come in partway through, they learn new practices as they're continuing, they continue once they leave the dojo. We'll do an elevator pitch, talk about goals and success measures, both for the product and what their learning goals are. We'll do a community map, which is kind of a mapping exercise where we talk about who the stakeholders are, who the people who know the product well are, who the builders are. Oftentimes drawing is as a Venn diagram, and we have people put their own names up there. It's interesting where they place themselves. It gives us an idea of where the strengths or weaknesses in the community might be. And then finally, we do this thing called a skills matrix, which is a simple grid, people's names in rows, the skills we want to learn across the top in columns, and people map out what skills they're interested in learning. So not every person needs to learn every practice or upskill on every single skill that the entire team is looking at during the 6 weeks in the dojo. I want to share one aspect of this about the team name that I don't want to overlook. We encourage teams to come up with fun names. So one of the teams we had was a team that built this IVR system. They were moving it to the cloud, so they called themselves Cloud Talica. We actually had laptop stickers made for that team. When teams leave the dojo at the end of their 6 weeks, we have a celebration. We kind of recap and recount everything they learned and what they accomplished. There's often cake involved, and for this particular team, their team leader went out and had this Cloud Talica cake made for their exit. So I'm talking a lot about practices here, but one of the other things that we've seen with these dojos in these large organizations is they actually have a huge impact on the culture of the organization. So I worked with one team, actually it was this team, the Cloud Talica team. Their lead developer was this woman named Fripp, great developer, and there was another young man on the team named Fahad, who had just joined the organization about 6 months ago. He was straight out of school. And at the end of their 6 weeks, we were doing sort of a retrospective of what everyone learned, what people liked. And Thripti said, the greatest thing I got out of this dojo was I got to know Fahad. And we were saying, okay, tell me more. And she was kind of lamenting the fact that he had been working on her team for 6 months, but she had no idea who he was as a human being, because they were kind of off in cube land, their work was very siloed and structured and doled out, and they weren't really working effectively as a team. So for her, getting to know her teammates, and in particular Fahad, this new person on the team, was kind of a key thing for her. The other thing that happens in the dojo is multiple teams come in at one time. So different organizations have different sized dojos. Some dojos hold 2 teams at a time. The large retailer that kind of started this built a huge space out where 10 teams could be in there concurrently. And as the teams are coming in for their 6-week experiences, we don't start them all at once. So it's not like we say on July 1st we're starting 6 teams or 10 teams for 6 weeks. We like to stagger the teams. So some teams will start this week, 2 weeks later, some more teams will start, 2 weeks after that, other teams start. And what we find happens quite frequently is you'll be in the 2nd week working with a team. They'll come up with some kind of problem, some constraint, some security problem they're trying to work around, firewall rules, whatever the case might be, and they'll look to the coaches for help. And the coaches will say to them, instead of helping them, you know what, the team 4 rows down from us, this is their team name, they solved the same exact problem 3 weeks ago. Go talk to them. And then the learning becomes more about people in the organization learning from each other than these coaches who are kind of forcing learning on them. It also fosters these weak connections. What I mean by weak connections is sort of like secondary network effects. We all have our groups of friends and coworkers that we work with all the time in our organizations, and there are lots of people that we don't know. So coming into the dojo, you start making these sort of secondary network connections with people, and it strengthens the organization overall as a whole, because people start learning who else in the organization can help them when they run into certain problems. I want to talk a little bit more about the space a bit. So this book, Clever Digs, written by Jenny Quillian, I would highly recommend everyone read. It's not just about physical spaces. There's a lot of social dynamics in this book that Jenny wrote about that do tie back to the physical spaces. But the basic premise of the book is the spaces we work in can actually make us dumber or smarter. They can have an impact on our ability to think and how well we can perform. The way we like to think of these dojos, in an ideal situation, everything would be on wheels. Chairs would be on wheels, tables would be on wheels, TV monitors would be on wheels, whiteboards would be on wheels. Every single possible thing would be on wheels, possibly even movable walls. And the team would come in every morning, and depending on what they were going to be working on that day, they would reconfigure the space to meet their needs. So if they were planning on doing mob programming that day, they would reconfigure the space for mob programming. If they were going to be doing work in pockets of 2 or 3 and they needed 3 work areas, they could reconfigure the space to work in that kind of situation. We do want to have a lot of whiteboards, TVs, areas where we can hang information, make work visible, all of those aspects of delivery that we're used to thinking about. These are a couple examples of some physical spaces. So this is a large space that multiple teams can go in. That space on the left is a little bit smaller. This one can hold about 10 teams. The space on the left holds 5 teams at most. The area that you see with the circular couch is actually the demo area. So one of the other aspects of these spaces that we have with teams is we do have a demo area where all teams, even if there's 10 teams in the dojo, there's one spot where every team goes to do their demo every 2.5 days. Demo schedules are posted, so anyone in the dojo can attend anyone else's demo, and this becomes another way for us to sort of socialize the learning, what's happening, what teams are developing, what products, across everyone in the entire dojo space. In that book, Clever Digs, Jenny Quillian tells this story about a vending machine. So there was a university, students were learning programming. There were sort of 2 rooms next to each other. One was a room where people would congregate around tables, and the other room was a place where mentors worked. So at the end of the room, there was a table, and there'd be 3 or 4 mentors or helpers there, help desk people, if you will. And when students had problems, they would go into the other room and go talk to the people at the help desk. There were vending machines in the back of the room where the help desk people sat, and students used to congregate around those vending machines. At one point, an administrator came in and said, we got to get rid of these vending machines. Students are congregating, there's too much noise, I don't know what's going on here, but obviously these don't belong in the help desk area. So they had them removed. Administrator comes back 2 weeks later. The line of people talking to the help desk people is stretching outside of the room into the other room. And basically, they started doing some investigation, and they learned what happened is these students are all working on the same problem. So they would congregate around these vending machines while they were waiting to talk to people at the help desk, start realizing they were all running into the same issue, and then invariably someone would say, oh, I figured that one out last week, and they were sharing information with each other and learning how to fix their problems from each other, and they didn't have to go to the help desk people. So the social space, the physical space that we set up, has an impact on how well we network with each other and how well we learn from each other. Last point I want to make about this flow is we don't just cut teams out at the end of the 6 weeks. We go through an exit interview process with them. That is largely talking to them about how they're going to maintain what they've learned, the new practices, once they leave the dojo and they get back to their normal work area. That involves a lot of questions like what's going to prevent you from continue to working this way as you move back into your normal work area, and how can we help? And then we have sort of scheduled visits that we do with the teams at regular intervals after they leave the dojo, and we also pop in a lot of times just unexpectedly, unplanned. So I've got a couple minutes left. Whether or not you want to try a dojo, here are the things that I know to be true. I don't have metrics like Jez and Nicole to prove this out. This is experiential, but these are what I would say I know these to be true. First, things start better when we start with the outcomes. No matter what kind of learning we're intending to do, we start with the outcome that we're hoping to achieve and drive everything from that. The second thing I would say is knowledge is not a thing. Language is important. Metaphors are important. We use these terms like knowledge transfer and knowledge management, and I just think they're flat out wrong. Knowledge is not like a car that you can load on a transport barge and move from one place to another. If I have knowledge, I can't simply transfer it to someone else. Instead, I think we're better off thinking in terms of knowledge creation, and the best we can do as coaches is foster environments and opportunities for other people to create knowledge for themselves. So I said knowledge is not a thing for the most part. I want to tell you a quick little story. I built this. This is a Pultec EQ. If you went out to buy a Pultec EQ, these were used all the way back to like Beatles recordings. They're classic equalizers. You could spend £1,000 on one of these, or 1,000 euros. If you wanted to have a stereo pair, you'd be talking 2,000 euros. If you buy a kit, they're about 200 euros a piece, so quite less expensive if you build your own. So I put this together, including soldering all these individual capacitors and resistors on this thing. About halfway through, you have to turn it over and solder some parts on the other side, and then you flip it back and solder more. I missed flipping it back. When I missed flipping it back, the guy came over who was mentoring me and said, "Whatever you do, save the board." And I was like, "What do you mean save the board?" And he was saying, "Look, these resistors, capacitors, they're pennies if you break it. We can get you more, you can replace it. If you break the circuit board, you're starting over from scratch." So that was something that wouldn't immediately occur to me. I was immediately like, oh my gosh, I have to unsolder this piece, get it unstuck, and flip it around. As I was learning to solder as well, they have great instructions on their website about how to solder and how to do this. There's nothing that compares to him saying, nope, this is the angle you want to be holding that soldering iron at. This is how you want to feed the solder in. And to know you have enough solder, you should flip it over and you should see this little bead of solder, round bead on the other side. All written instructions, completely different experience having somewhere there giving me feedback on the soldering that I was doing. So the difference between these two types of knowledge are called tacit and explicit. Tacit is knowledge in someone's head. It's really hard to write down and get out. Explicit knowledge is the stuff that's easy to put into words. And I think with video, we are getting to a point where maybe we can do things in terms of making knowledge explicit more easily than we could just with written word. There's still a difference though, and there's still a huge difference in being in an environment with someone where they can offer you real-time feedback on what you're trying to learn. If you're helping someone learn, be very clear about what can be taught tacitly and what could be taught explicitly. I think companies make too much of a rush to say, great, you have this knowledge, write it all down so we can scale it to everyone in the rest of the organization. Things just don't work that way. Okay, last point. As a coach, you don't have to teach everything. If you come up with the exercises, the work will teach people what they need to know. So your job as a coach is more to say what exercises are going to help people actually learn what they need to learn. And with that, I think we'll close it here. Maybe a couple questions, if there are any.
We only have time for a few questions.
What can we use of this without hiring a skilled coach? You can do immersive learning without hiring a skilled coach. I don't think you're going to do this dojo concept without a skilled coach. Coaches are sort of the core of the product, if you will. If you think of the dojo as a product, without highly skilled coaches, I don't think you have a dojo. It would be like going to a martial arts studio with the idea that you're going to learn Aikido, but there's no one there to teach you Aikido. So you could pull books out, you could watch videos. I'm not sure how well that would work. Have you experienced any failed dojo? If yes, then do you know what impact it had on the company team? Yes, I've experienced sort of failed team challenges or team experiences inside the dojo. Those mostly come in the form of this. We go through the entire intake process, explain exactly what the dojo is, that it requires a commitment to learning. The team comes in, leadership, everyone agrees, and then when they get in there, nope, 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 deliver, 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 deliver. There's absolutely no time for learning whatsoever. In those cases, we will actually sometimes end that team's 6-week experience early and have them kind of leave the dojo. In other cases, we'll let them stay in there, but we basically say, look, we're not coaching anymore. The team's just using this as kind of a work space. If they get an hour or two, maybe we'll try and help them with a couple practices here and there. I suppose the other impact it could have on a company if the dojo completely failed is they lose the investment in the physical space and in hiring the coaching staff that they've hired. How those short sprints affect meeting length. You spend more or less time during the meetings. So nitpicking, and might be a language thing here, but the first thing I object to is the word meeting. So done properly, Sprint planning, retrospectives, et cetera, are not meetings. These are practices. They have agendas. There's an outcome that's desired. If you're experiencing these things as meetings, there's a chance you kind of need to revisit them in the first place and say, how might we better do these to get the outcomes? Having said that, yes, they are much shorter. So we generally, our demos are sometimes half an hour. Retrospectives can be 20 minutes. Teams might struggle during the first few sprints to break stories down into that 2.5-day time frame, get them that small. But maybe by week 3, boom, 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 they've got it figured out. Week 4, and sprint planning takes 45 minutes to an hour oftentimes.
Okay, our time is up.
Okay.
But thank you so much for your wonderful talk. And this is a little present from the craft organizer team with a drawing of you.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much.
Thanks for listening.